I'm trying my very best not to fangirl out and be like, oh,
Oh, look at that.
yes, this
My
is
heart. Oh my goodness. I love it.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Janelle Molony, author of Un-Adoptable, Faith Beyond Foster Care, and I am so happy to have as a special guest with me today, Ms. Ashley-Rhodes Courter, who wrote Three Little Words. And let me just tell you, this book is hefty. A little backstory on her. Ashley grew up in foster care. She spent from the age of 3 all the way to 12 in foster care, moving from home to home to home, 14 different homes, and they weren't great. The good ones were few and far between. And so for her to write her story is very empowering for foster youth and giving them a voice, giving them a person that can speak out if they're not able to or don't want to say, hey, these kind of things do happen. She is a survivor. She is phenomenal. She's funny. She's so, so cute. Ms. Ashley-Rhodes Courter is here to talk with us today. I'm so excited.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great opportunity to connect and chat and do something other than, cartoons and wrangle 3 children in a quarantine.
Right. So how is it going with the kids in the quarantine for you?
I have to say, if I'm looking at a strengths-based approach, I'm a social worker, so I went on to get a master's degree in social work, so I'm using a lot of those skills right now. But it actually has been really great in a lot of ways, in some ways terrifying. I'm primarily a writer and a speaker, so I spend a bulk of my time ordinarily on the road, traveling, keynotes, workshops. Obviously, none of that is happening. So I think economically, it's been a really big adjustment for the family. But for the first time in years, I'm having breakfast, lunch, and dinner with my family and my kids. And
but is that a good thing or not a good thing?
Admittedly, it's a good thing. I mean, never, because normally they're in school. I mean, I can't even remember the last time I was able to have lunch with them because they're in school or I'm usually working or traveling. So the closeness the family has been able to achieve and some of that attachment work has been really amazing. Our family as well, we have an adopted kiddo. My husband and I were foster parents for many years. And so those elements of family are really special. But I'm absolutely going to be perfectly honest. There have been unbelievably challenging, trying times. It's very, very stressful, but a major help for us has been planning. So we always say, I don't even remember where I heard this, but failing to plan is planning to fail. Period. And so for me, I've always been a really strong worker bee. And now I've had to put a lot of that energy into just being like, full-time mom and including my husband, getting his booty organized. So he's like a 4th child sometimes, but he's up for the challenge, but lots of lists, lots of everyone empowering their own skills, taking responsibility in all of this. And we've used obviously a global pandemic can be really scary, the sudden shift in schedules, but what we've done is really work to empower our kids. So we talk about the fact our kids are, 5, 7, and 8.
Ooh, that's the dirty age. Why? And everything's dirty. Everything's
always
broken.
Always broken, dirty. Like this is our guest room that they're not allowed in. Like that's the only reason there's still things on the walls. The rest of the house, forget about it. But, it's letting go of some of that stuff has been really a big deal. Making sure that I'm not, if they don't make their beds, who cares at this point? Are you kidding me? That's not even on the radar. So I've had to learn to let go of a lot of control and a lot of structure. I don't like the unknown. I don't like the unpredictable, but that's everything of this pandemic. And so setting new rules, new routines, but empowering the young ones to do what they can do to survive all of this and make the family unit as a whole. We take obviously an individualized approach when we're meeting the needs of our little ones and all of the members of our family, but we've really pushed this idea of togetherness and what we're going to do to be able to function holistically as a family and a collaborative unit during all of this. And I think refocusing in that way has been really helpful, because if you think about a typical family schedule, the kids have their grades. We got kindergarten, first grade, second grade. It's their grades, their teacher, their homework, their class, their food allergies, their preferences. But this has been a huge exercise in togetherness and being flexible. And I think everyone really quickly suffers when everybody's not on board with the program moving forward. So I think that the togetherness has been really great, but I think it's been successful only because I had to do a lot of work on myself and make sure that I'm letting go of what I think should happen. I haven't been as productive as I feel like I could be, should be, ordinarily am. So that's really been challenging. Like any social worker, I have multiple hats, multiple jobs. You yourself are a mom with multiple plates spinning at all times. So I'm sure you've experienced this as well. It's just juggling those priorities and becoming kind of that master delegator of both empowering individually, but collectively, so that we don't kill each other and, end up in the prison system that I fought so hard to overcome I don't want to be a statistic. So, managing those daily chaoses in our family has been a challenge, but I really have enjoyed getting to know them as these little humans, and so much of their personalities have come out, and my kids just happen to be at a stage where they're changing and growing so quickly. I think just during this pandemic, at least one of them has gone up an entire shoe size, so I'm not missing that, which is great. But I also have to plan for having those really emotional, chaotic, stressful times, and have provisions in place to make sure that everyone's mental health needs, physical needs, emotional needs are being met. So, there is no shame in asking for help. And I think as someone who is a survivor in any capacity, be it a single parent, someone who's experienced child abuse, foster care, domestic violence, whatever your story and hardship is, it can be really difficult to not be in control, to not know what's going on, to not have a specific plan. And
Or
you are
ask for help. You're used
bingo.
to doing everything.
Yes, I'm going all over the place, but that was my primary
Yeah.
point, is that it's really hard to ask for help, but make sure that you have a therapist on standby, that you have doctors ready to go. That's been very humbling as someone who feels like they have to do it all, or they can do it all, or they've had to do it all. Now you don't have to do it all. And having forums like this where you still can connect with other people virtually has been amazing. And no other time in history has mental health services and other opportunities been accessible and available to people. So that's been another positive, but you have to be able to know that it's not failing to ask for help.
Yeah.
I saw this hilarious meme the other day. It was like, if you're happy and you know it, shake your meds. And it's like, yeah, it's okay. Talk to a psychiatrist, talk to a therapist, and make sure that you are asking for the help, because asking for help is not weakness. And that's definitely something that's hard for people who are used to shouldering everything on their own.
I wish I could normalize that. And I try in almost every time I get on the internet, I'm like, hey, you need to have a therapist. You need to have, even if it's not a professional therapist, someone who is your Yoda, because even before you adopt, because you're walking off into this uncharted territory, and you're going to take on all their trauma. You have to be ready, like mentally clear the cobwebs, because get ready. So it doesn't have to be your trauma, but I mean, the mommy's heart, or even a daddy's heart, when your baby's hurting, oh, you hurt too. And that mental anguish, it hurts you. And we're
Well, and
going
not
through
only
that.
that, well, and if you are a family who has other children, something that was so we have 2 biological children and 1 adopted kiddo, and they all have very different needs, different traumas, issues, but something that I wasn't prepared for was the feeling and what you do when someone you love is hurting someone you love,
Ooh,
be it physically, mentally. I know I'm just kind of jumped into a really big topic
yeah,
there,
that's
but
deep.
that's hard. And that's something that a lot of adoptive families face. But again, it's about having that support system. If it, I was talking about just surviving a pandemic, and then you were like, well, yeah, holy moly, if you are a foster adoptive family in the middle of a pandemic,
Yeah.
that, I mean, and a support system is 100% essential. And it is the reason I've been able to flourish as a kiddo from the foster care system. Having that support system has allowed me to become a functioning adult. And also, what's going to allow our family and other families to thrive and survive is having that community, having the respite, having people to talk to.
Mhm.
That's, I mean, it should be like a requirement on an application for a home study is, who are your mental health professionals?
Yes.
They will be essential.
Yeah, I read your book um, while I was waiting to adopt, and I was getting so sick of people telling me stories about how everything was beautiful and wonderful, and I was adopted from China, so I have no mom, and now poof, I have this amazing beautiful family,
Right.
and I was just getting really sick of it. And I said, well, who's got the stuff that I keep seeing? Like when I'm looking at a kid's profile, I see some stuff and I go, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to even wrap my head around what my child is going through. And we were planning to adopt an older child. So when I read your story, I was like, oh, that's tough.
That's awesome. Well, and that was sort of my intention in writing both of the books, was to have it be something that was helpful and has purpose. So it's not just blabbering about my experiences. I really
Right.
chose to share pieces of my life and our experiences that would be helpful to parents, social workers, those who have experienced foster care, whatever, whoever finds this book. Maybe it's an educator that works with marginalized populations. I mean, this was really supposed to be something that was helpful and not just, oh, the violin. I was a,
Yeah.
oh, so I'm so glad that you found it and hopefully found it to be helpful in your experiences.
Yeah.
It's always a work in progress.
It definitely was a wake-up call for me, and I really appreciated hearing from someone who has been through all of these things, because so often we hear from the parents, we don't hear from the children, or we hear from the adults who have processed everything. And
Right.
you're writing from such a close, I mean, when you were done within 5 or 6 years, you were writing the book, and so you're still like in it. So
Well, I started it when I was a teenager because
yeah.
I had just won a scholarship contest, and I had written an essay called Three Little Words, and that's how the book started. So writing and journaling and the arts in general have always been a really great therapeutic outlet for me.
Mhm.
And so I had, the diaries and the journals. And so writing nonfiction, it's very different. Like, I'm not a fiction writer. I'm terrible at fiction. Everyone's like, oh, are you going to write fantasy? And I'm like, reality is always like, why do you have to make anything up? Like, reality is so just shocking and unbelievable as it is. So it was sort of like writing a giant term paper. I mean, I had my experiences, but I also had my case files because of a lot of other legalities in the case. So I was, unlike a lot of kids, able to get hold of all of my records.
Oh,
And it was
wow.
over 80,000 documents that were my case files. And so that
Whoa.
was really a big part of the source material, as well as going back and kind of steeling myself to do interviews with former foster parents and caseworkers and educators. So it was many, many, many years in the living and the making. But hopefully it's something that will continue to inspire and influence and encourage, because this is not easy. This is not rainbows and sunshine, but I will forever be grateful for those who intervened on my behalf. And now I get to spend my adult life thanking those who put themselves forward for other kids in the hopes that they can have even a remote chance at a better life.
So after everything you went through and even having biological kids, you still fostered and then you adopted. So my like big question to you, because my son is also interested in being a foster or adoptive parent, and I think, gosh, you went through all this stuff. Why would you want to not save, rescue, but re-enter that world? Because that world, even just to start now having police or social workers or all those people back in your life, that could be triggering. And I wanted to ask you, how did you get from so much of that to, yeah, now I'm going to go in like a champion, and like, how did you transition to being a parent?
Well, it's funny you say that, because let's see, my husband and I got married in 2010, and very shortly thereafter, we actually had a potential kinship situation that sort of sped up and facilitated our desire to foster, give back. So we ended up getting licensed because we had a kinship situation, and I knew enough about the system to say, hey, if we really want to make sure this kiddo doesn't just get removed and lost in the system, we should go ahead and get licensed. So there is zero chance that if this comes to pass, we will be the first place, because we'll be licensed, we'll be ready to go. And before we even knew our license had been approved, we got a call for a placement. As was the case then and is the case now, there are not nearly enough homes to go around. They are desperate for foster parents. So what's really unique about Florida is that we have an incredibly high number of pill mills and prescription drug abuse. And the opioid crisis has hit Florida very, very hard. And so we have a lot of babies and infants and children under 5 who are in care. Nationally, the statistics lean more heavily toward older kids.
Right.
It is much more difficult to find placements, and particularly permanent placements, for older children. But in our area, I was just so surprised that there were all of these little ones that needed stable homes, primarily because of drug addiction and lots of other issues. But the cycle of abuse is so prevalent. So I can't tell you the number of times we had grandparents who were in their 30s because they were children themselves when they had children. Their children were children when they had children. So I was always an advocate and just eager to help. I love that you pinpointed, well, how did you do that? It could be so triggering. That thought never even occurred to me. So I discovered the problems and the issues and the triggers as it was happening. It didn't even occur to me. Again, I was never really focused on my own mental health. That was something I had to learn along the way. I was just so determined to be a helper and make a difference. And so I was approaching it from that, determined, redheaded, stubborn advocate who was gonna, make a difference. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. As I started experiencing traumas and triggers during my time fostering, that's when it was a really big wake-up call for me, when I was kind of in the middle of it, like, oh, this is hard. This is hard for unforeseen reasons. I didn't realize, especially, taking care of babies and little ones was very different. When I was working with older kids, that's really when I had to keep myself in check and watch it. Like, there was once, we had a 9-year-old little girl, and I walked into her room, and we never really, told the kids what we did, and they knew I was a social worker, whatever, but she had taken my book off the shelf, and she fell asleep reading 3 Little Words.
Oh, 9 is too little. Oh, I was going to ask you, would you ever let your kids read your book? My son wrote half mine, so oh well.
Well, but the interesting thing is that my books are published under the young adult division of Simon & Schuster. So they're meant to be young adult reads, but I never would have suggested it of any of our kids. That's just that's just not something I did. But she had fallen asleep reading it, and the book was like on her, and my heart just exploded because I was like, here is this 9-year-old little girl, and I can very vividly remember the sights, the sounds, the smells, the feelings of being 9. And I just remember hoping and thinking to myself, like, oh, I hope this little girl has all of the, magical experiences and that happily ever after that I was able to, achieve and eventually realize. And it was just such this like heart bursting, happy moment of like, oh my goodness, here's my foster daughter reading a story about me as a foster child. I mean, it was this really
Right.
powerful full circle moment for me. And now that I have had, I mean, we've had over 25 kids. So we've had this, big experience. And I think my story hits me harder now than it did when I was younger, because when I was younger, it was just me. I lived it. It's like, I didn't fully understand when people are like, oh no, it's a big deal that you're not incarcerated or that you've gone to college. It's like,
Uh-huh.
I didn't totally understand it.
Yeah.
But now I look at my 5, 7, 8-year-old and I'm like, oh, what
All
I
of
was
these
doing.
things are in these little people. Right.
Yeah. And I was like, I should not have been taking care of babies when I
Right.
was 6 and 7.
Right.
I should not have been wandering a trailer park at 3 begging for food. Like, those things aren't normal. I think the most traumatic thing in the lives of my kids is broccoli right now. So, it's experiencing the world through a different lens. And I had not anticipated my own trauma, but also the residual trauma from fostering. So that's part of what inspired us to transition to open a mental health agency for children and families. I started Sustainable Family Services, which provides direct mental health services and supports for children and families. So when I talk to people about burnout and what you do, I always try to say, remember why you started advocating or putting yourself out there. And it might transition over the years, but don't lose the passion. You can change your purpose, but don't lose that passion. So for me, when I was in college, my husband and I were guardian ad litems, which is CASA, Court Appointed Special
Okay. We have
Advocate.
those. Yep.
Yeah, so that's what we did just out of college. And then after we were married, we were like, hey, we want to take on a little bit more. So then we fostered. And then when we had this, really horrible tragedy, in Three More Words, which is my second book, I talk more about the adult life and like the foster kids that we had, those situations. But after that incident, we were like, well, this isn't working for us now, but we don't want to lose that passion. So what else can we do? And that's when we started some of these other programs, so
Right.
your passions are going to shift. Burnout happens, but if you can recognize it and own it and see it as not a failure, but an opportunity to maybe transition to something
Right.
else, that is, I think, what the goal should be. You may not be a lifetime foster parent, or whatever the situation is, educator, volunteer. But if you can transition into something else that is still meaningful, still impactful, I mean, that's that's the
Yeah.
hope and that's the
You
goal.
remind me of the x-ray technicians where they have to wear the badge for how many exposures they have to radiation.
I didn't
And
know that.
yeah, so especially if they're pregnant and all this. So they have to wear a little badge every time they do x-rays, and it keeps track of how much radiation they are exposed to. And after a certain point, they can't be an x-ray technician anymore, or they have to
Oh,
transition to something else or take time off and all this. And so it doesn't matter where that trauma is coming from, whether it's your personal trauma or observing the trauma or just being in the trauma realm. It's almost like your meter just hit its limit, and it's nothing personal. It's just, oop, I met my limit.
that's a great parallel. I hadn't heard that, but I mean, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. And oh, everybody goes through that.
So like if your son decides to foster or adopt, I think they're already ahead because you're like, hey, some stuff might be triggering. And I would have been like, oh, pish posh. But no, you're right. That's definitely the case. And just, again, that support system, managing it, expecting it, and having a plan in place.
Thank you again for joining us for the first part of this interview with Miss Ashley-Rhodes Courter. If you are interested in her book, it is Three Little Words, and the second book is Three More Words. If you're interested in my book, it's called Un-Adoptable: Faith Beyond Foster Care. I'm so excited for what the next part of the conversation holds, so don't miss out. Click the next button. Let's continue. See you there.